Today I'm going to use a Google Earth tour to introduce my students to um, the impacts of the Great Migration on northern cities in the United States just after the turn of the century, actually around 1920s, 1930. Specifically, the Great Migration took place between 1915 to 1930 in the United States. To give a little bit of a background, we will look at our first caption. Um, the Great Migration, by definition, is the relocation of millions of African Americans from the rural areas of the South, which means the areas outside of the suburbs, an area that we like to call the country. Lots of farms, plantations. That's where the African Americans were originally brought over to do slave work. After or during World War One, the factories had many jobs that were left open due to the men leaving to go fight in the war. Now, as we know, our economy turned to a wartime economy, and that meant that we needed those factories to be running. So, what we saw was this mass migration of African Americans up to northern cities. That was difficult for Northerners because there was still a lot of racism and discrimination in the North. It wasn't anything like in the South, where there was actually de jure segregation, which is segregation by law. The Jim Crow laws were very hard on African Americans. So even though there was still racism and discrimination in the North, many African Americans flocked to the opportunities that were provided to them in big cities like Chicago and New York. And that's where I'm actually going to focus on today, is Chicago and New York. So in Chicago, the northern industrialists wanted to make a lot of money. Of course, that's what they're trying to do. Is they're they run factories. So when they usually had jobs open for all of the immigrants, they were no longer able to fill those because, like I had said, the all the guys went to fight in the war. So they recruited all of these African Americans from the South, and uh, and they were able to obtain work up in the North. Okay, so we're gonna go um, through our visit now. Okay, so moving on with our tour, we're going to, oh, just one second. Okay, so when we look at Chicago, this is where we really see the birth of blues clubs. And that is in jazz clubs, or rather, that is where and in New York, we also see these clubs. We see these cultural roots come alive in the northern cities. So we've talked about places like Chicago. We've talked about places like New York. In New York, we are going to focus on the Harlem Renaissance and places like the Cotton Club. We call it Renaissance means the rebirth. And what we are seeing being reborn is this African American culture. What I'd like my students to do is think about before and after the Harlem Renaissance. So we know that Renaissance means a rebirth. And what we are going to do is show that visually we understand continuity and change over time in the US. We're going to use African American culture as the example, and we are going to show visually what their culture look like, and think about the problems that they went through, that not only African Americans but also other people living in New York went through. So the Cotton Club specifically was a famous jazz music nightclub, and it was actually opened back then, and we saw a lot of people rise to the stage, the most nationally recognized stages, because of this Cotton Club. It Although it was a white only establishment, it and it was underground, for that matter, because they allowed alcohol and African Americans to perform, which were not publicly enjoyed. So we see the Cotton Club still in action, and we can see that there are still these impacts, these changes that are going on in our culture, in American culture, in African American culture, in white culture, and how and the Cotton Club is really a good example of that old and new being blended together. So, what I'd like you to do, students, is I'd like you to draw a picture of this. Draw a picture of before and after, and be thinking about how music, the blues, jazz, which was part of the African American culture, how that had an impact on American life. Think about how much of an impact art, music specifically, has on your own life. And I'd like you to show me that through the eyes of other Americans when they are considering this aspect. Jazz, the blues, this aspect of African American culture and the effects it had on the rest of the United States. Okay, the directions and requirements are following this.